Hey, this is Ina, in with you on the Fight Back. And today let's talk about unemployment, or the Industrial Reserve Army. Now, how do we normally see this question framed? The question of unemployment. Well, for the most part, it's framed individually. It's an individualized problem, and we have the normal excuses that come up, whether from the media, the politicians, or just the so-called common sense of society. For instance, many of those who are unemployed or underemployed blame themselves. It's their fault. They did something wrong. They're not good enough. They're not educated enough. They're not well trained enough. Or whatever the case may be. They're not keeping up with the times or whatever. Or politicians or the media attacks immigrants. Immigrants are the problem. They're stealing your jobs. Or they attack minorities of whatever sort. And, well, we have the other excuse for the unemployed. Well, they're just lazy. They don't want to work. They just want to get food stamps and live on the dole. Right. Or we have that the problem, and you've especially been hearing this lately, the problem is entitlement spending. That's right, entitlement spending. Somehow that is the problem. Well, yeah, and the truth is, if we look at past these so-called excuses, and if we look at the truth is, getting a job under the current social system is those jobs are dehumanizing and exploitive. There really are no exceptions to that. But the converse of that is that you need work in order to live. All workers do. Pretty much that's what you have to sell, your labor power, your ability to labor. And you need that, and you need a job for your subsistence, whatever that may be. And you can't just escape into the wilderness. I know a few people who probably could, but for the most part, we all have to live in society in some manner. And what happens if you don't have work, or if you're underemployed? Well, think about it. You're pretty stressed out. You can't provide for yourself or your family. And this isn't some chauvinistic thing. If you can't provide for those around you, you're definitely going to be stressed out. And the fact is, our very ability to make us labor, our ability to labor is pretty much what makes us human. It allows us to create. And think about it. That's lying idle. You're unemployed. You're perhaps well trained in a certain skill or whatnot, and you can't use it. You can't do it. You can't provide for people. You feel a loss of dignity, and it seems that it's all your fault. Again, those excuses. Now, the media, the politicians, the common sense that we get in society, they pretty much diagnose this problem as some individualized thing, or almost a normal functioning of society. And by normal, I very much mean they analyze it in a very non-critical sense, as you would expect. Now, let's forget all that for a moment, and let's look at unemployment in this sense. The best way to fight unemployment is to correctly diagnose it, and from there, to remove the conditions that give rise to it. So where does unemployment come from? Well, a pool of unemployed or partially employed labor is an inherent, stressing that, inherent feature of capitalist society. It is this pool of unemployed or partially employed labor is created and reproduced by the accumulation of capital itself. And Marx calls this pool of the unemployed the industrial reserve army of labor, or just the reserve army of labor. Now, the accumulation of capital means growth. You have more capital, more means of production, you can produce more, you can make more money. The capitalist does that, of course, by exploiting the working class. Now, as capital grows, it means a new and a large scale and more mechanized methods of production, which competition obliges capitalism to introduce, those individual capitals to introduce. So, for instance, 20 or 30 years ago, perhaps computers were not quite so prevalent in the labor process. Now, due to competition, more and more capitalists are using computers, and it's making they're allowed to make more money, and they're allowed to produce more through that. Now, this new machine, for instance, say you didn't have a computer or some form of automation, and before, to do a certain task, it required 10 workers. Now, say you can introduce that new machine, put it in there, and you can produce even more than you did before, twice as more. But instead of 10 workers producing, you only need 1 or 5. Doesn't matter. In a sense, you not only increase your profit margin, you've cut your labor costs. And this growth of capital increases the demand for labor. Because if you can produce more, you're going to want to introduce more of these machines and have more workers coming in. But mechanization substitutes machinery for workers, as I just said. Instead of 10 workers, you only need 5 for a particular machine. But you want to have more machines. And as a result, you'll want to have more workers. Now, as you substitute machinery for workers, you're thus reducing, in a sense, your demand for workers. Now, the net demand for labor depends on the relative strengths of these two effects, i.e., the mechanization and the demand for labor. So when employment is stronger, or when the demand for labor is stronger than the displacement due to mechanization for long enough, this will mean you'll have more workers coming in, and this will dry up the reserve army of labor, i.e. the unemployed, and the resulting will be a shortage of labor, and the resulting shortage of labor will lead to an acceleration in wages, which will automatically strengthen, in a sense, displacement relative to unemployment. So let's just backtrack for a moment. As you're bringing in more labor to work these more machines, you're going to have to pay them more, and that's going to cut into your profit margin. So you kind of want to cut that out. You're going to want to get workers. You want to hire less workers, but you still want to make as much money. So what do? You develop more machines, or better machines that are more efficient, so you can cut your labor costs, i.e., you can still produce as much or even more, but with less workers. And because if wages are rising, that's cutting into your profit margin. Now, and if wages are rising and cutting into your profit margin, your capital is not going to be growing as much as you want. Now, you also have the capitalist, again, wants profit and wants to keep labor costs down. In this way, when the capitalist is introducing better labor-saving machinery, when the capitalist is laying off workers, their capitalist is still accumulating, but you're still replenishing the industrial reserve army of labor. You're still increasing the number of unemployed or partially employed. Capitalists also try to keep labor costs down by importing labor from areas of high unemployment or low wages. And capital tends to, in some cases, it can be very mobile. It can move from point A to point B, from country A to country B. Now, capitalists that are operating in areas of high wages are not going to make as much money if they're working in areas of low wages. So, in a sense, they can move jobs to a place where they can make more money with lower labor costs, and therefore take people out of the workforce, and they enter the industrial reserve army. And no matter the period, no matter the country, capital has always created and maintained a reserve army of labor. Capital has always maintained the system to work has to have unemployed. You see this not just in former industrial towns that have now become wastelands. You see this not just because of the current economic crisis. You see this with the starving masses in the third world, those guest workers who are imported. You see this in the effects of capital flight. So now that we know the diagnosis, that unemployment is inherent in capitalism, I ask you, how should we cure it?